Hi guys, and welcome back to this series on the boom in the 1920s and why America had a boom, what the boom meant for America, and all of the things you need to know to pass your GCSE. So in the last lesson, we discussed how the 1920s were a time of plenty for many people, with lots of people buying items on hire purchase, lots of people buying stocks on the margin, lots of people feeling like they were extremely prosperous and they were entering a period of kind of good living. We've got loads of gadgets and we are living a really, really nice quality of life. Now, today, what I'm going to talk about is the fact that despite this, and despite the fact that for lots and lots of ordinary people, things did improve significantly, not everyone benefited, and actually millions of people remained poor, particularly those in rural areas or who worked in America's older traditional industries. By 1928, it was estimated that over half the population had incomes so low they were unable to afford basic clothing or food. So what I'm going to do is go through the different groups that did not benefit from the boom, and hopefully explain to you and show you, why it was that some people didn't benefit. Okay, I'm going to start with farmers. And farmers were a very, very large group in America that did not share in the prosperity of the 1920s. The total farming income had dropped from 22 billion in 1919 to 13 billion by 1927. So clearly, from kind of an outward perspective, just looking at those two figures, it shows you that there is a significant drop in the productivity, but also the kind of viability. So the viability means, the economic prosperousness or the economic benefit of this industry. Now, the main problem was overproduction, because during the war, as I said previously, America were able to loan money, but also to sell goods, including food products, all over the world. And after the war, demand went down because European farms recovered. If you also remember, America put the Fordney-McCumber tariff on lots of European food goods coming into America. Now, what happened as a consequence of that was that European countries put similar tariffs on American goods coming into Europe. So the demand for food actually went down quite significantly after the war, because American goods were now really expensive in Europe, so they weren't being sold. So we have too much food produced. Now, just in the same way that we had higher stock prices when demand went up, well, if you have too much for the demand, prices are going to go down. So we see a drop in prices, almost 50% when in wheat prices in particular, at this time. We also have high-tech developments like combine harvesters, which meant more food is being produced. So we have an overproduction because of the kind of legacy of the war. And we also have new developments, which really should be a good thing, but which mean we're producing too much food. At this time, we just have so many farms falling apart as well in terms of crumbling financially, that we see 6 million farmers migrate to the cities. Often moving to the cities meant they would then become unemployed or poor in the cities and the urban industries. So one of the main issues is overproduction, too much supply for demand, which led to a significant drop in prices. Now, the second group I want to talk about is the old industries. Now, old industries are products like cotton and coal, things which we have been using for generations and generations, but which at this point in time become less demanded. Less demand for cotton and wool as a result of new synthetic materials such as rayon, which is cheaper. So, factory produced goods such as rayon, much, much cheaper to buy than cotton. So companies want to use rayon, consumers want to buy rayon, and therefore cotton workers, things like that, they suffer. Coal suffers because oil and electricity are far more competitive. And as we know, so many more houses have been connected to the electricity network, and wages have not increased at a rate of company profits and shareholder dividends. So even though, as I said, all the stocks are rising on the stock market, that doesn't mean that actual wages are rising for the people that work for these companies. Now, a couple of pieces of really specific factual evidence for you. In North Carolina, men were paid $18, and the minimum that you needed to live was $48. So you can see that they are significantly under the poverty line. 42% of workers in old industries were below the poverty line, okay? So these people were having particularly bad times of this situation. Now, the next group I want to talk about are African Americans. Now, in this course, we look at the African American experience at a number of moments across the course. And we're going to look very, very briefly right now at what their experience was like in terms of poverty and whether they could benefit from the boom in the 1920s. Now, many African Americans worked on farms as laborers or rented small areas of land from a landowner. These farmers were known as sharecroppers. They paid back their rent with their wheat or with their product, okay? Now, this kind of comes as a legacy of slavery, with lots of African American families living still in the South, where they would have lived, previous generations would have lived on the plantations, and they are just kind of transitioning from slavery into becoming farmers, but without many of the things they need to be really successful, because they haven't been helped as a community, particularly by any of the American policies that were supposed to try to, encourage them to be able to take, buy big plots of land or be successful in that way. They only are able to access small areas of land and they have to rent it. They're not able to buy this land. Now, sharecroppers have to give part of their crop to their landlord as rent, which means they don't have very much product. Living conditions are awful and millions still lived in poverty. 3/4 of the farmers who were made unemployed at this time were African Americans. So you can see that we can combine kind of the farmers and the African Americans' plight together, and that actually all the people who are doing really, really badly as farmers, of that group, 3/4 of them are African Americans. Now, another group which are doing, are not able to benefit from the boom were the Native American or Native Indian communities. Now, most of these groups' land was seized by mining companies, and their traditional way of life disappeared when they were forced onto these reservations. Now, a reservation is kind of an area of land which they were forced onto. Now, the problem with this was that the Native Indian communities had a very migratory life. They moved around with the buffalo. And when they were forced onto reservations, they lost all of that part of their culture, essentially. They weren't able to move with the buffalo in the same way they had done previously. Often the reservations were poor, so crops did not grow or prosper, and many of this community were poorly educated and had lower life expectancy, okay? So the Native American or Native Indian community were also not able to benefit from the boom. Now, as an example, I just want to show you a case study, and that case study is going to be Chicago, okay? So Chicago. Now, Chicago is one of America's biggest cities at this time. It was a center of steel, meat, and clothing, and these industries employed lots and lots of people. Now, the problem is that these industries had busy and slack periods. Now, that meant that there were times where they were busy, there were times where they would employ lots and lots of people, and there were slack periods where they would then make those people unemployed again. They only needed people for certain parts of the year. It was not a year-round employment, okay? This meant that people became seasonally unemployed. Only 3% of people in Chicago owned a car, and many could not afford to buy items on hire purchase as they feared not being able to afford the repayments if they lost their job. So the whole concept of hire purchase is that you pay it over time. Now, if you know you're going to be seasonally unemployed, you can't benefit from any of these schemes. They also could not afford the new chain supermarkets and preferred to shop where local grocers could give them credit, okay? And we even see in Chicago a split of the newfound kind of entertainment, which I'm going to talk about in the next video, but the movie craze, for example. So even cinemas showed a divide. Wealthy could go to the cinema and pay $1 for a movie, and the poor could go and pay 10 to 20 cents for a much worse seat. So this really shows us that, despite all of what I've said about the boom and everything, that it was not accessible to everyone, and that actually quite a lot of people, and especially in these larger cities, huge groups of society were unable to access lots of these benefits. Now, the last thing I want to talk to you about is this idea of inequality, because I think at this time, inequality is one of those words which really, really, really sums up America. Now, Extreme inequality. The richest 5% of the population earned 33% of the money, and the poorest 42% of the population earned 10% of the money. So in this kind of diagram over here, we've got the very, very top showing you that 32% of the income in America is earned by just 5% of people. Whereas at the bottom, you can see that very, very thin segment, that is 10% of the money is earned by 42% of the people. It shows huge divisions in wealth. In 1921, there were 21 millionaires, and by 1927, there were 15,000. The poorest 6 million families earned less than $1,000 a year, so they were below the poverty line. So we have 15,000 millionaires, and yet we have 6 million whole families who can't even afford to eat. We have 5% unemployment in 1919 and 1929. And the worst hit of these communities are poor white families, African Americans, Hispanics, Native Americans, Native Indians. The other issue is that because we have laissez-faire policies, we have Republican kind of style of government, we have very, very, very little intervention to help those who have not been able to benefit from the boom. So what I want you to take away from this is that, yes, we have a boom in the 1920s, and yes, there are all these new opportunities to access goods and consumerism and all these things, and buy on the stock market and get a job and be prosperous. But at the same time, under the surface of all of this, there are huge swathes of the community who are extremely poor. And these particularly are people who live in the rural countryside or out in the countryside, particularly farmers, and these kind of minority or smaller groups that I've just talked about living within America.